A millionaire man got a homeless woman he found on the street pregnant. Everyone mocked him, but what he discovered left everyone in shock. The morning was cold and grey in the bustling city of New York. The streets of the financial district were gradually filling with hurried people, executives with briefcases and heels resonating against the pavement. Among them, the figure of Alexander Morgan stood out, a tall and attractive man in his mid-30s, dressed in an impeccable designer suit and a cashmere coat that protected him from the icy wind. Alexander walked with a firm step towards the imposing building of International Bank, where he held the position of executive vice president. His mind was already on the important meeting he would have that morning with foreign investors, mentally reviewing the figures and strategies he would present. However, something unusual caught his attention and pulled him from his thoughts. On the corner of the street, huddled against the wall of a building, he saw a young woman. Her clothes were worn and dirty, her tangled hair partially hiding her face. She was visibly shaking, hugging herself in an attempt to combat the cold. The image contrasted strongly with the luxurious and opulent surroundings of the financial district. Alexander stopped, surprised by the pang of compassion he felt. Something about the trembling figure of the young woman deeply moved him. Without thinking twice, he approached her. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly. "Are you all right?" The young woman looked up, revealing luminous green eyes that seemed out of place on her tired and dirty face. For a moment, Alexander was left breathless, captivated by the intensity of that gaze. "I'm fine," she murmured, with a voice that, despite her, bank. However, as he walked away, he couldn't help but look back one last time. To his surprise, the young woman was also looking at him with an indecipherable expression on her face. Their gazes crossed for a brief instant, and Alexander felt a strange connection, as if he had just experienced a significant moment. Without understanding why, shaking his head to clear his thoughts, Alexander entered the bank, not knowing that this brief encounter was about to change the course of his life forever. Meanwhile, the young woman, whose name was Sarah Andrews, watched Alexander's figure disappear into the crowd. With trembling hands, she clung to the luxurious coat, inhaling its scent of expensive cologne and feeling the softness of the fabric against her skin. Sarah was not who she appeared to be. Beneath that facade of poverty and helplessness hid one of the richest heiresses in America. The only daughter of the Andrews, owners of a business empire, Sarah had decided to embark on a social experiment, living on the streets to understand the reality of the less fortunate. What had started as a week-long project had extended to a month. Sarah had discovered a completely new world, full of difficulties, but also of a raw and real humanity that she had never experienced in her bubble of privilege. And now, this encounter with the generous stranger had left her deeply moved. In her month on the streets, no one had treated her with such kindness and respect. The image of Alexander's warm eyes and genuine smile was etched in her mind. Sarah slowly got up, still wrapped in the coat. She knew her experiment was coming to an end. Soon she would have to return to her life of luxury and responsibilities, but something had changed in her. And that change had a name and face, the man who had given her his coat without thinking twice. With a new determination in her gaze, Sarah began to walk. She needed to find a way to thank that man for his kindness, and perhaps in the process discover if that connection she had felt was something more than just a moment of kindness between strangers. In his office on the top floor of International Bank, Alexander tried to concentrate on the documents in front of him, but his mind kept going back to the green-eyed young woman. Why couldn't he stop thinking about her? There was something in her gaze, a mixture of vulnerability and strength, that intrigued him. "Mr. Morgan," his assistant's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "The investors are here for the meeting." Alexander nodded, straightening in his chair and adjusting his tie. It was time to return to the reality of business and finance. However, as he headed to the boardroom, he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever see that mysterious young woman again. What Alexander didn't know was that fate had very different plans for him and Sarah. Their paths were destined to cross again, and when they did, their lives would change forever. The meeting with the investors went smoothly. Alexander presented the bank's projects with his usual eloquence and professionalism, managing to impress the attendees with his command of numbers and strategic vision. However, in the moments of silence, his mind inevitably returned to the scene from that morning. At the end of the day, as he gathered his things to go home, Alexander realized he had completely forgotten about the coat he had given away. He smiled to himself, thinking that at least it would be serving a good purpose. He left the bank and headed to his car, a luxurious sports car parked in the underground garage. As he drove to his penthouse in the exclusive Upper East Side neighborhood, Alexander couldn't stop, thinking about how surreal that day had been. On one hand, he had closed one of the most important deals of his career. On the other, he couldn't get a stranger he had seen for just a few minutes out of his head. Upon arriving at his building, the doorman greeted him with a bow. "Good evening, Mr. Morgan. Everything all right?" "Yes, Frank. Everything's fine," Alexander responded distractedly. "Good night." Already in his apartment, Alexander poured himself a whiskey and went out to the balcony. From there, he could see the city lights extending as far as the eye could see. Normally, this view filled him with a sense of power and satisfaction. He had worked hard to get where he was, building his fortune from scratch. However, that night as he observed the city, Alexander felt restless. Where would she be now? Would she be safe? Warm? He shook his head, trying to push away those thoughts. It was ridiculous to worry so much about a stranger. Tomorrow would be another day, and surely he would forget all about this. But fate had other plans. The next morning, Sarah woke up early in the small hostel where she had been staying. She had decided it was time to return to her normal life. But before that, she had a mission: to find the man with the coat and return his generous gift. She dressed in the clean clothes she kept in a backpack, transforming back into the Sarah Andrews that the world knew: elegant, refined, and self-assured. However, something had changed inside her. Her month on the streets and the encounter with Alexander had left a profound mark on her. With the coat carefully folded in her arms, Sarah headed to the financial district. She didn't know exactly how she was going to find Alexander, but she was determined to try. Meanwhile, Alexander arrived at the bank, his mind still distracted by the events of the previous day. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost bumped into an elegant young woman who was standing in front of the bank's entrance. "Excuse me," he muttered, looking up. And then the world seemed to stop. In front of him was the same green-eyed young woman from the day before, but completely transformed. She was no longer wearing dirty and worn clothes, but an elegant dress and designer shoes. Her hair, previously tangled, now fell in soft waves over her shoulders. "It's you," said Alexander. Surprised Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "Yes, it's me. I came to return this to you," she said, extending the coat. Towards him, Alexander took the coat mechanically, unable to take his eyes off her. I don't understand," he finally managed to say. "It's a long story," Sarah responded. "Perhaps we could have a coffee and I'll explain everything." Alexander looked at his watch. He had an important meeting in half an hour, but at that moment, nothing seemed more important than uncovering the mystery of this woman. "Of course," he said, smiling. "I know an excellent place nearby." As they walked together towards the cafe, Alexander couldn't help but glance sideways at Sarah. Who was this woman really? And why did he feel that his life was about to take an unexpected turn? What neither of them knew was that this coffee would mark the beginning of a story that would change their lives forever. A story of love, secrets, and discoveries that would lead them to question everything they thought they knew about themselves and the world around them. As they sat at a secluded table in the elegant cafe, Alexander and Sarah looked at each other, each trying to decipher the other. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but the tension between them was palpable. "So," Alexander began, breaking the silence, "who are you really?" Sarah took a deep breath. It was time for the truth. "My name is Sarah Andrews," she said, carefully, observing Alexander's reaction. "And yes, I am that Sarah Andrews." Alexander's eyes widened as he recognized the name. The Andrews were practically royalty in the American business world. But how? Why were you... On the street, Sarah completed with a sad smile. It's complicated. You see, a month ago I decided to embark on an experiment, so to speak. I wanted to understand how people less fortunate than me really live. So I left my life of luxury and went to live on the streets. Alexander listened with a mixture of amazement and admiration. That's incredible, he finally said, but also dangerous. Why risk yourself like that? Sarah shrugged. All my life, I've lived in a bubble of privilege. I wanted to see the real world, understand people's real problems, and I must say it has been a life-changing experience. And then I appeared and ruined your experiment, said Alexander with a wry smile. Sarah laughed, a sound that made Alexander's heart skip a beat. You didn't ruin it, she said softly. In fact, you were the best part of the whole experience. Your act of kindness, it was the most genuine thing I've experienced in a long time. Their gazes met, and for a moment the world seemed to disappear around them. There was an undeniable connection between them, something that went beyond the extraordinary circumstances of their encounter. Alexander began, but was interrupted by the sound of his phone. He looked at the screen and frowned. I'm sorry, it's from the bank. I have to take this. As Alexander got up to take the call, Sarah observed him, feeling a mixture of emotions. On one hand, she was relieved to have been honest about her identity. On the other, she feared that this revelation would change the way. Alexander saw her. When Alexander returned to the table, his expression was serious. I'm sorry, Sarah. An emergency has come up at the bank. I have to go. Oh, said Sarah, trying to hide her disappointment. Of course, I understand duty calls. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of frustration and longing. Sarah, I'd like to continue this conversation. Could we see each other again? Maybe dinner tonight? Sarah's face lit up. With a smile, I'd love to. They exchanged numbers and Alexander hurried out, not before casting one last look at Sarah. She watched him leave, her heart beating with an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time. That night, in one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, Alexander nervously awaited Sarah's arrival. He had reserved a private table with views of the city, wanting to impress her. However, a part of him wondered if that was really necessary with someone like Sarah Andrews. When she arrived, Alexander was left breathless. Sarah looked radiant in a black dress that accentuated her slender figure. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her green eyes shone with anticipation. You look beautiful, said Alexander, softly kissing her cheek. Sarah blushed slightly. Thank you. You look very handsome too. They sat down and ordered, falling into an easy and natural conversation. They talked about their jobs, their passions, their dreams. Alexander told her how he had built his career from scratch, fighting against class prejudices in the financial world. Sarah shared her concerns about the future of the family business and her desire to make a real difference in the world. As the night progressed, they both realized that there was a deep connection between them, something that went beyond physical attraction or mutual interest. It was as if they had known each other all their lives, as if their souls recognized each other. You know, said Sarah as they savored dessert, I never thought my little experiment would lead me to meet someone like you. Alexander smiled, taking her hand across the table, and I never thought a simple act of kindness would change my life in this way. Their gazes met, charged with emotion and promise. But just when it seemed the moment would lead to a kiss, Sarah's phone rang insistently. With an apologetic grimace, Sarah looked at the screen. Her expression instantly changed to one of concern. I'm sorry, I have to take this. It's my father. Alexander nodded, watching as Sarah got up to take the call in private. As he waited, he couldn't help but feel a pang of uneasiness. What would the reality of their separate worlds mean for them? When Sarah returned, her face was pale and tense. Alexander, I'm so sorry, but I have to go. A family emergency has come up. Is everything okay? Asked Alexander, standing up concerned. Sarah shook her head. I don't know. My father didn't give me details, but he sounded very upset. I have to go home immediately. Of course, said Alexander. Let me take you. It's not necessary, Sarah began, but Alexander gently interrupted her. I insist. I won't be at peace if I don't know you've arrived home safely. Sarah looked at him gratefully and nodded as they hurriedly left the restaurant. Alexander couldn't help but think about how quickly life could change. In less than 48 hours, this woman had entered his life and he could no longer imagine a future without her. The ride in Alexander's car was tense and silent. Sarah looked out the window, lost in her thoughts, while Alexander cast worried glances in her direction. When they arrived at the impressive Andrews mansion, Sarah turned to him. Thank you for everything, Alexander. Tonight has been special. For me too, he responded, taking her hand. Sarah, I know you have to deal with whatever is happening now, but can we see each other again? Sarah smiled despite the concern in her eyes. I'd love to. I'll call you soon, I promise. With a final handshake, Sarah got out of the car and hurried towards the entrance of the mansion. Alexander watched her until she disappeared inside, his heart full of a mixture of hope and anxiety. As he drove back to his apartment, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and the strange series of events that had brought them together. He felt he was on the brink of something big, something that could change his life forever. But he also felt a growing uneasiness, as if fate was about to test this newly formed bond. What Alexander didn't know was that inside the Andrews mansion, a crisis was unfolding that would threaten not only his budding relationship with Sarah, but also the future of both families. Fate had set in motion a series of events that would test their love, their loyalty, and their deepest values. In the imposing library of the Andrews mansion, Sarah found her father, Richard Andrews, nervously pacing back and forth. Her mother, Emily, was sitting in an armchair, her face pale and worried. Dad, Mum, what's going on? Asked Sarah, her heart beating with anxiety. Richard stopped and looked at his daughter, his eyes full of a mixture of fear and determination. Sarah, honey, please sit down. We have to talk about something very serious. Sarah sat next to her mother, who immediately took her hand, squeezing it tightly. The company is in trouble, Richard began, his voice tense. Serious trouble? We've discovered that one of our main partners has been embezzling funds for years. The losses are astronomical. Sarah felt as if the ground was moving beneath her feet. But how is that possible? Didn't we have regular audits? Richard nodded bitterly. Yes, but this partner was very skilled. He had been hiding the losses with a series of complex transactions. Now that everything has come to light, we're on the brink of bankruptcy. There has to be something we can do, said Sarah, her mind working at full speed. We can sell assets, look for new investors. We've considered everything, Emily interrupted, her voice broken with emotion. But the situation is too serious. We need an immediate solution or we'll lose everything. Richard sat heavily in his armchair, suddenly, seeming much older than he was. There is one option, he said slowly, but I don't know if we're willing to consider it. Sarah looked at her father, a feeling of dread growing inside her. What is it? Richard and Emily exchanged a meaningful look before Richard continued. The Blackwood family, they've expressed interest in a merger with our company. With their financial backing, we could overcome this crisis. Sarah frowned. But the Blackwoods are known for their aggressive business tactics. Do we really want to associate with them? We don't have many options, honey, Emily said softly. But there's something else. Richard took a deep breath before continuing. The Blackwoods have put a condition on the merger. They want you to marry their son, Michael. Sarah jumped up, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. What? You can't be serious. We're in the 21st century, for God's sake. They can't expect me to get married for a business deal. We know, honey, said Emily, standing up to hug her daughter, and we wouldn't ask you to do something like this if it wasn't absolutely necessary. But without this merger, we won't just lose the company. Thousands of employees will lose their jobs. Entire families depend on us. Sarah pulled away from her mother's embrace, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She thought of Alexander, of the connection they had forged in such a short time. She thought of her month living on the streets, of the people she had met, of the struggles she had witnessed, and now she had in her hands the power to help thousands of those people or to condemn them to unemployment and poverty. "I need time to think," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is too much." Richard nodded, his face a mask of guilt and concern. "We understand, honey, but we don't have much time. The Blackwoods are expecting an answer in the next few days." Sarah nodded mechanically and left the library, her steps echoing in the silence of the mansion. She went to her room, closed the door, and collapsed on the bed, tears finally falling down her cheeks. Her phone vibrated with a message. It was from Alexander. "I hope everything's okay. I can't stop thinking about you. Can we see each other tomorrow?" Sarah looked at the message, her heart torn between family duty and her own desires. How could she choose between the security of thousands of families and the promise of true love? And how could she explain the situation to Alexander without pushing him away forever? As the night wore on, Sarah debated in a torment of doubts and fears. She knew that the decision she made would change not only her life, but that of many others. And in the midst of all this, the image of Alexander, his kind smile and his eyes full of promises, kept tormenting. Her fate had placed a cruel test before her, and Sarah had no idea how she was going to overcome it. The next morning dawned grey and rainy, as if the weather reflected Sarah's inner turmoil. She had spent the night awake, debating between her family duty and the yearnings of her heart. When she went down for breakfast, her parents were waiting for her in the dining room, their faces tense and worried. "Good morning, honey," said Emily, trying to smile. "Were you able to rest?" Sarah shook her head as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Not much. I've been thinking about everything you told me last night." Richard exchanged a look with his wife before speaking. "Sarah, I know we're asking something huge of you, but I want you to know that whatever your decision, we'll support you." Sarah looked at her father, surprised by his words. "But Dad, what will happen to the company if I don't accept?" Richard sighed heavily. "We'll look for other options. Maybe we'll have to declare bankruptcy and start over." "It won't be easy, but—" "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "I can't allow everything you've worked for to crumble, and I can't be responsible for thousands of people losing their jobs." She took a deep breath before continuing. "I accept the Blackwoods' proposal." Emily stifled a sob as Richard stood up to hug his daughter. "My brave girl," he murmured against her hair. "We're so proud of you." Sarah let herself be hugged, fighting against the tears that threatened to spill. At that moment, her phone vibrated with a message. It was Alexander, asking if they could meet for lunch. Sarah felt as if her heart was breaking in two. "I have to go out," she said, pulling away from her father's embrace. There's something I have to do." Alexander anxiously waited in the same cafe where they had had their first real conversation. When he saw Sarah enter, his face lit up with a smile that quickly faded upon seeing her somber expression. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, standing up to greet her. Sarah sat down, avoiding his gaze. "Alexander, there's something I have to tell you." With a heavy heart, Sarah told him everything: her family's financial crisis, the Blackwoods' proposal, her decision to accept the arranged marriage. With each word, she saw how the light in Alexander's eyes went out, replaced by a mixture of pain and disbelief. "You can't be serious," Alexander said when she finished. "Sarah, we barely know each other, but I feel there's something special between us. You can't throw that away for a business deal." Sarah fought against the tears that threatened to spill. "It's not just a business deal, Alexander. It's thousands of lives that depend on this decision. How can I put my personal happiness above that?" Alexander took her hands across the table. "There must be another way. Let me help you. I have contacts at the bank. Maybe we can find a solution." For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe it was possible, but then she remembered the gravity of the situation, the urgency in her father's eyes. "There's no time, Alexander. The Blackwoods are expecting an immediate answer. If we don't accept now, they'll withdraw their offer." "Then give them time," Alexander insisted. Ask them for a few more days. I promise I'll do everything in my power to help you." Sarah looked at him, her heart torn between hope and duty. I'll try, but I can't promise anything." They said goodbye with a tense hug, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. As Sarah walked away, Alexander watched her, determined not to lose her without a fight. In the Blackwood mansion, Michael, the eldest son of the family, listened with growing irritation to his father's, William's, instructions. "Remember, son," William was saying, pacing around his luxurious office, "this marriage is crucial to our plans. With the Andrews under our control, we'll be unstoppable." Michael frowned. "Father, is all this really necessary? We could simply buy Andrews Corp when they declare bankruptcy." William stopped, looking at his son with disdain. "And lose the opportunity to have the Andrews in debt to us? No, son. This marriage will give us much more than just financial assets. It will give us power, influence." "But I don't even know this girl, Sarah," Michael protested. "You'll meet her soon," William responded with a cold smile. "And you'll do whatever is necessary to make her fall in love with you. Understood?" Michael nodded reluctantly. "Yes, father." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Alexander was hurriedly entering his office at the bank. He had a mission and was determined to fulfill it. He spent the next few hours making calls, reviewing documents, desperately seeking a way to save Andrews Corp without the need for the arranged marriage. As the day progressed, Alexander realized the magnitude of the problem. The Andrews situation was even worse than Sarah had told him, but he wasn't willing to give up with each obstacle he encountered. His determination grew. Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing for the dinner, where she would officially meet Michael Blackwood. She looked at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman who looked back at her. She wore an elegant black dress, her hair pulled back in a sophisticated bun, but her eyes were dull, lacking the spark that Alexander had awakened in her. "It's time, honey," said Emily, peeking into the room. "The Blackwoods have arrived." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath before following her mother. As she descended the stairs, her phone vibrated with a message from Alexander. "Don't give up. I'm working on a solution. I love you." Those last two words made Sarah's heart skip a beat. How could she go through with this knowing that Alexander loved her? But before she could consider her options, she found herself face to face with Michael Blackwood. "Sarah," said Michael, taking her hand and kissing it softly, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you." Sarah forced a smile, aware of the expectant looks of both families. "The pleasure is mine, Michael." As they headed to the dining room, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Alexander and his promise to find a solution. Would it be possible? Or was she clinging to a vain hope? The dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of barely disguised tension. William Blackwood dominated the conversation, talking about the benefits of the merger and the brilliant future that awaited them. Sarah barely touched her food, divided between her duty and her true desires. Suddenly, the butler hurriedly entered the dining room. "Excuse the interruption," he said, addressing Richard Andrews. "Sir, there's someone at the door who insists on seeing you. He says it's urgent." Richard frowned. "Who is it?" "A Mr. Morgan, sir. He says he has crucial information about the company's financial situation." Sarah jumped up, her heart beating fast. "Alexander," she whispered. William Blackwood looked at Richard suspiciously. "Who is this Morgan, and what does he have to do with our affairs?" Before Richard could respond, Alexander burst into the dining room, his face flushed with haste and emotion. "Mr. Andrews, Sarah, I'm sorry for the intrusion, but you have to listen to me. I've found a solution." All eyes turned to Alexander, some with surprise, others with irritation. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "Who the hell are you?" William Blackwood roared. Rising from his chair, Alexander straightened up, facing William's furious gaze. "I'm Alexander Morgan, Executive Vice President of International Bank, and I have a proposal that could save Andrews Corp without the need for this merger." The dining room erupted into chaos of voices. William Blackwood demanded that Alexander be thrown out. Michael observed the scene with a mixture of relief and curiosity, and the Andrews looked at Alexander with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Amidst the chaos, Sarah and Alexander's gazes met. At that moment, they both knew that, no matter what happened next, their lives had changed forever. Fate had set in motion a series of events that would test their love, their loyalty, and their deepest values. And so, with Alexander's unexpected arrival, the dinner that was supposed to seal the fate of two families became the stage for a drama that was just beginning to unfold. The cards were on the table, and now it was time to see who would have the winning hand in this game of power, money, and love. The Andrews Mansion's dining room had turned into a battlefield. William Blackwood, his face red with anger, confronted Alexander Morgan, who maintained an apparent calm despite the palpable tension in the environment. "How dare you barge in like this?" William bellowed. "This is a private meeting." Richard Andrews, recovering from the initial surprise, intervened with a firm voice. "William, please, I think we should hear what Mr. Morgan has to say." Sarah, her heart beating rapidly, couldn't take her eyes off Alexander. Had he really found a solution, or was he just prolonging the inevitable? Alexander, silently thanking Richard with a gesture, pulled a folder from his briefcase. "Mr. Andrews, after analyzing your company's financial situation, I've developed a restructuring plan that could save it without the need for a merger." William let out a scornful laugh. "A restructuring plan? In just a few hours? Don't make me laugh, young man." But Alexander didn't let himself be intimidated. Calmly, he began to explain his plan. A combination of debt refinancing, sale of non-essential assets, and a bridge loan from International Bank. As he spoke, Richard's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. This could work," Richard murmured, reviewing the documents Alexander had brought William. Seeing that the situation was slipping out of his hands, tried to regain control. "Richard, don't be naive. This plan is a fantasy. Our offer is the only viable option." But Emily Andrews, who had remained silent until that moment, spoke with a soft but firm voice. "I think we should seriously consider Mr. Morgan's proposal. After all, our daughter's future is at stake." Sarah looked at her mother gratefully, feeling a lump in her throat. For the first time since this crisis began, she felt she had a real choice. Michael Blackwood, who had observed the entire scene with growing discomfort, finally intervened. "Father, perhaps we should—" But William silenced him with a furious look. "Silence, Michael. The adults are talking." Turning to the Andrews, his voice took on a threatening tone. "Think about it carefully. Our offer has an expiration date. If you don't accept it now, it will be withdrawn forever." Richard and Emily exchanged a meaningful look. Finally, Richard stood up. "William, we appreciate your offer, but I think we need time to consider all our options." William rose abruptly, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "You're making a serious mistake. Let's go, Michael." As the Blackwoods withdrew, Michael cast one last look at Sarah. For a moment, their eyes met, and Sarah thought she saw in them a mixture of relief and gratitude. Once the Blackwoods had left, the dining room was plunged into a tense silence. Alexander, aware that he had burst into an intimate family moment, began to apologize. "Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, I'm very sorry for my intrusion. But Richard interrupted him, extending his hand. "Don't apologize, Mr. Morgan. You've given us hope when we needed it most." Sarah, unable to contain herself any longer, approached Alexander. How did you do it?" Alexander looked at her with a mixture of love and determination. "I couldn't let you go without a fight, Sarah. I spent the last few hours moving heaven and earth to find a solution." Emily, observing the exchange between her daughter and Alexander, intervened softly. "I think we all need to rest and process what has happened, Mr. Morgan. Would you mind coming back tomorrow to discuss the details of your proposal?" Alexander nodded, grateful. "Of course, Mrs. Andrews, I'll be here first thing in the morning." As Alexander said goodbye, Sarah accompanied him to the door. Once out of earshot of her parents, Sarah could no longer contain herself. "Alexander, I don't know how to thank you." He took her hands in his. "You don't have to thank me for anything, Sarah. I'd do anything for you." Their gazes met, charged with emotion and promise. For a moment, it seemed they were going to kiss, but Alexander held back, aware of the delicate situation. "Rest, Sarah. Tomorrow will be a new day." As she watched Alexander walk away, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The crisis wasn't over, but for the first time in days she felt there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The next morning, the Andrews mansion was a hive of activity. Alexander arrived early, as he had promised, and locked himself in the study with Richard and Emily to discuss the details of his plan. Sarah, unable to concentrate on anything else, waited anxiously in the garden. It was there that her best friend and confidant, Olivia, found her. "Sarah, what's going on?" Olivia asked, concerned. "I saw that handsome man come in. Isn't he the same one you told me about?" Sarah nodded, proceeding to tell her friend everything that had happened in the last few days. Olivia listened attentively, her eyes widening more and more as the story unfolded. "My God, Sarah," Olivia exclaimed when Sarah finished. "It seems like the plot of a soap opera. And what are you going to do now?" Sarah sighed, looking towards the house. "I don't know, Liv. Everything depends on whether Alexander's plan works, and if it works, I have to decide what I really feel for him." Olivia took her friend's hands. "Sarah, I've known you since we were children. I've never heard you talk about anyone the way you talk about Alexander. I think you already know what you feel." Before Sarah could respond, they saw Alexander come out of the study, followed by Richard and Emily. The three had serious expressions, but there was a gleam of hope in their eyes. Richard approached his daughter. "Sarah, honey, can you come for a moment? We need to talk." With her heart in her throat, Sarah followed her parents and Alexander back to the study. Once inside, Richard took the floor. "We've reviewed Mr. Morgan's plan in detail," Richard began, "and we believe it's our best option. It won't be easy, it will require a lot of work and some sacrifices, but it will save the company and the jobs," and Emily completed, with a tired but genuine smile. Sarah felt an enormous weight lift from her shoulders. "So, I won't have to marry Michael?" Richard shook his head. "No, honey, you're free to choose your own path." Sarah couldn't contain the tears of relief and gratitude. Without thinking, she threw herself into Alexander's arms, who received her with a strong and protective embrace. "Thank you," Sarah whispered against his chest. "Thank you for not giving up." Alexander gently pulled her away, looking into her eyes. "Sarah, there's something I have to tell you. But before he could continue, the sound of the doorbell interrupted the moment. Seconds later, the butler hurriedly entered the study. "Sir," he said, addressing Richard, "the Blackwoods are here, and they seem very upset." Richard frowned. "Show them to the living room. We'll be right there." As they headed to the living room, Sarah felt fear taking hold of her again. What did the Blackwoods want? Had they discovered Alexander's plan? Upon entering the living room, they found William Blackwood, who seemed about to explode with fury at his side. Michael had an expression of guilt and anxiety. "Richard!" William bellowed, "How dare you reject our offer for this ridiculous plan of this upstart?" Richard, maintaining his calm, replied, "William, we haven't rejected anything. We're simply considering all our options." But William wasn't willing to listen to reason. "Nonsense, I know you've been conspiring behind our backs. Well, you should know that I have information that could destroy your reputation and that of your family forever." Sarah felt her blood run cold. What information could William have? It was then that Michael, to everyone's surprise, stepped forward. "Father, enough, I can't go on with this." William looked at his son in disbelief. "What are you talking about, Michael?" Michael took a deep breath before continuing. "The information you have, it's false. I fabricated it." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Everyone looked at Michael with a mixture of surprise and confusion. "What did you say?" William asked, his voice dangerously low. Michael, although visibly nervous, stood firm. "You heard me, Father. I fabricated that information because I thought it was what you wanted, but I can't continue with this farce. The Andrews haven't done anything wrong." William, furious, grabbed his son by the shirt collar. "You're an idiot. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Alexander and Richard quickly intervened, separating William from Michael. "I think it's time for you to leave," Richard said firmly. William, realizing he had lost all advantage, let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't over, Richard. I'll have my revenge, I swear." As the Blackwoods withdrew, Michael turned to Sarah. "I'm sorry," he said simply before following his father. Once they were gone, everyone looked at each other, still processing what had just happened. "Well," said Emily, breaking the silence, "I think this changes things." Richard nodded, turning to Alexander. "Mr. Morgan, it seems we owe you much more than we thought. Your plan will not only save our company, but it has freed us from an alliance that could have been disastrous." Alexander, however, only had eyes for Sarah. I just did what I thought was right." Sarah, unable to contain her emotions any longer, approached Alexander. "No, you did much more than that. You saved me, you saved us all." And without caring about her parents' presence, Sarah kissed Alexander, a kiss full of love, gratitude, and promise. When they finally separated, Alexander looked at her with adoration. "I love you, Sarah. I know everything has happened very fast, but..." Sarah silenced him with another quick kiss. "I love you too, Alexander, and after everything we've been through, I'm sure we can face anything together." Richard and Emily observed the scene with a mixture of surprise and joy. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "Well, it seems we have a lot to celebrate. How about we all go out to dinner?" As the family prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't stop smiling. Just a few days ago, she felt trapped in a destiny she hadn't chosen. Now, thanks to Alexander's love and determination, she had a future full of possibilities ahead of her. However, as they left the mansion, none of them noticed the car parked across the street, where William Blackwood watched with eyes full of hatred and thirst for revenge. The storm may have passed, but new challenges awaited them on the horizon. And so, with love triumphing over adversity, but with new threats lurking in the shadows, another chapter closed in this story of passion, power, and redemption. Fate had brought Sarah and Alexander together, and now it was up to them to write the rest of their story, not knowing that their greatest tests were yet to come. The following months were a whirlwind of activity for Sarah and Alexander. The restructuring plan for Andrews Corp was in full swing, and although it required long hours of work and difficult decisions, little by little positive results began to show. Sarah, determined to prove her worth beyond her surname, had immersed herself fully in the family business, bringing fresh ideas and a new perspective that was revitalizing the company. Alexander, for his part, had become an invaluable ally, offering his financial expertise and unconditional support. However, not everything was rosy. William Blackwood, humiliated and thirsty for revenge, had initiated a smear campaign against the Andrews and International Bank. Malicious rumors and unfounded accusations began to circulate in business circles, testing the strength of Andrews Corp's recovery. One afternoon, while Sarah and Alexander were working late at the office, Richard entered with a worried expression. "We have a problem," he announced, dropping a newspaper on the desk. The headline read, "Fraud in Andrews Corp's recovery. Anonymous sources suggest financial manipulation." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Dad, this is ridiculous, you know. Everything we've done has been completely legal and transparent." Alexander, frowning, examined the article. "This has William Blackwood's stamp all over it. He's trying to sabotage us." Richard nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know, but the damage is already done. Our shareholders are nervous and some of our business partners are starting to doubt. We have to do something," said Sarah, her mind working at full speed. "We can't allow William to destroy everything we've worked for." It was at that moment that Emily hurriedly entered the office, holding her phone. "You won't believe who just called me," she said, with a mixture of surprise and hope in her voice. "Michael Blackwood." They all looked at her in astonishment. "Michael?" Sarah asked. "What did he want?" Emily sat down before answering. "He says he has information that could help us. Information about his father's shady business dealings." A tense silence fell over the room as everyone processed this news. Finally, Alexander spoke. "It could be a trap." Sarah, however, remembered Michael's expression the day he confessed to fabricating the false information. "Or it could be his way of redeeming himself," she said softly. After a long discussion, they decided to meet with Michael at a neutral location. The next day, in a discreet cafe in the city center, Sarah and Alexander found themselves face to face with their enemy's son. Michael seemed nervous, but determined. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he began. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm tired of my father's lies and manipulations." Over the next hour, Michael revealed a web of corruption and illegal business dealings that William Blackwood had woven over the years he handed over. Documents, emails, and recordings that proved his claims. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked, still skeptical. "He's your father, after all." Michael looked at her with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because I want to be better than him." With this new information, Sarah and Alexander returned to Andrews Corp. With renewed energy, they worked tirelessly for days, preparing a strategy to counter William's accusations and expose his own crimes. Finally, at an urgently convened press conference, Sarah stood before a crowd of journalists and cameras. With Alexander by her side and her family backing her, she began to speak. "We have been unjustly accused of fraud and manipulation," she said firmly. "Today we are here not only to refute those accusations, but to reveal the truth behind them." One by one, Sarah presented the documents and evidence that demonstrated Andrews Corp's innocence and William Blackwood's guilt. The room erupted into a frenzy of questions and camera flashes. As the news spread like wildfire through the media, William Blackwood watched as his empire crumbled. Within hours, his partners began to distance themselves, and authorities initiated an investigation into his businesses. In the days that followed, the media storm was intense, but Andrews Corp emerged stronger than ever. The transparency and honesty with which Sarah and her family handled the crisis earned them the respect and trust of the public and investors. Weeks later, on the terrace of the Andrews mansion, Sarah and Alexander contemplated the sunset, reflecting on everything they had been through. "Can you believe all this started with a coat?" Sarah said, laughing softly. Alexander hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "The best gift I've ever given in my life," he murmured. Sarah turned to look into his eyes. "Alexander, these months have been crazy. We've faced crises, threats, betrayals. But in the midst of all that, I found something I didn't know I was looking for." "What's that?" he asked, although his gaze suggested he already knew the answer. "You," Sarah replied, caressing his cheek. "I found the love of my life." Alexander smiled, pulling a small box from his pocket. "What a coincidence," he said, kneeling before her. "Because I found mine too." He opened the box, revealing a beautiful engagement ring. "Sarah Andrews, would you do me the honor of marrying me?" With tears of happiness in her eyes, Sarah nodded. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." As they kissed, sealing their engagement with the setting sun as witness, they both knew this was just the beginning of their story. They had overcome obstacles that seemed impossible, and they were ready to face any challenge the future held for them, as long as they were together. In the months that followed, life continued its course. Andrews Corp flourished under the joint leadership of Richard, and Sarah, with Alexander as chief financial advisor. William Blackwood faced the legal consequences of his actions, while Michael, freed from his father's shadow, began to forge his own path. Sarah and Alexander's wedding was an event that captured the attention of all of American society. In an intimate but elegant ceremony, surrounded by family and friends, they vowed to love and support each other for the rest of their lives. As they danced, their first waltz as husband and wife, Sarah rested her head on Alexander's shoulder. "You know," she murmured, "when I was living on the streets, I dreamed of finding a purpose, of making a real difference in the world." Alexander looked at her curiously. "And did you find it?" Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with love and determination. "Yes, I found it. I found love. I found my inner strength, and I found a way to use our position to help others. And it all started with an act of kindness from a stranger." Alexander kissed her softly. "It wasn't kindness, it was destiny. We were destined to meet, to love each other, to face these trials together." As the party continued around them, Sarah and Alexander lost themselves in their own world, dancing to the rhythm of music only they could hear. They had gone from being strangers to soulmates, from facing adversity to triumphing over it. Their story, which had begun with a chance encounter on a cold morning in New York, now extended towards a bright future full of possibilities. And although they knew that life would continue to present challenges, they were sure of one thing: together, they could overcome any obstacle. Because in the end, true love, the kind that is born from kindness, compassion, and mutual respect, is the most powerful force of all. And Sarah and Alexander had discovered that when you have that kind of love, there is no financial crisis, vengeful enemy, or family secret that can destroy it. Thus, with a passionate kiss that sealed their union and promised a future full of love and adventures, Sarah and Alexander closed a chapter in their lives and began a new one. A chapter they would write together, day by day, facing each dawn with the certainty that whatever happened, their love would always be their strength and their guide. And as the night wore on and the stars shone over New York, Sarah and Alexander's story became a legend, a reminder to everyone that true love exists and that sometimes all it takes to find it is an act of kindness and the courage to follow one's heart.